So what I'm going to try and do today is to demonstrate how imaging can, first of all, why imaging, second of all, how imaging. And for the how part, I'll stick to cancer, and for the why part, I'll mostly talk about cancer. So the majority of my interest, expertise, and experience lies in nuclear medicine or PET or molecular imaging, whatever gets you the grant money. And so I'm going to focus on that because that's what I know. So what I'll do is I'll start by pointing out the different modalities that are used in clinical imaging. It's going to be an entirely clinical talk, no mouse images, a few histopathology images, but otherwise all clinical images. And so I'll first briefly describe the various modalities that are available to us for imaging. Then I'll talk about some definitions of what we mean by imaging, because there's no point in talking about imaging in an esoteric sense. We need to, especially for a precision medicine group, we need to define a scenario where whatever modality we are going to use is going to be used in a setting where it will enable us, in a setting that will enable us to better define the kind of therapy we're going to give the patient. And in the process of illustrating the use of imaging in helping us guide therapy to cancer patients, I'll focus on cancer because that's the easiest model. Okay? So you'll see a lot of cancer, and hopefully using that model, you'll be able to extrapolate the use of imaging to other diseases, particularly in this institution. The other big focus is neuroscience, and we can talk offline or even online about how we would use neuroscience, how we would use imaging in neuroscience. So first, imaging modalities. X-ray, by which I mean all sorts of X-rays, from the one that you see with Röntgen's hand to computer tomography, is morphologically exquisite. What's happened in the century and more that we've been using X-rays is that the morphology that radiography, that plain radiography provides us has improved to the point where now when body bags come back from wherever we are these days, those body bags are not cut open, but they're put into a CT scanner, very high resolution CT scanner, so that you can get multi-micron, 20 micron, 30 micron images of the entire body. A lot of radiation is delivered, but delivering a lot of radiation to a dead body doesn't really matter, and gives us exquisite morphologic information that then enables the people who are looking at these bodies to better define where and how they will carry out their autopsy data. So CT scans have enabled tremendous improvements both in scale and in resolution and in efficiency of understanding morphologic abnormalities. CT scans and other radiographs, however, provide very limited functional information, which is provided by many of the other modalities that I'm going to briefly touch on. The modality that interests me the most from a preclinical perspective is optical imaging. Again, optical imaging provides micron resolution. So the resolution is very, very high. The sensitivity is also very, very high. With picomolar concentrations and sometimes better, you can get very good signal-to-noise ratios, and that enables us to find out what's going on at the multi-cellular level in most systems. So if it's so good, what's wrong with it? Why don't we use it all the time? Depth is a major problem. The optical signal is generally not transmitted over much more than a centimeter, which means that your detecting device needs to be very close to wherever the optical signal is coming from. And that is a problem with optical imaging when you go beyond, for example, rodents, and it certainly limits clinical utilization of optical imaging. Magnetic imaging is also wonderful, and especially in this day and age, like optical imaging, there's no ionizing radiation involved. And when there's no ionizing radiation involved, it's always much easier to study the modality because the modality is allegedly safe. So magnetic resonance enables us to get very high structural information, very high resolution structural information of a variety of processes. The concentration of water, for example, can be used to determine whether a malignancy exists. The concentration of water can also be used to determine whether there is a stroke and the area around the stroke in the brain, for example. So a lot of functional information can be obtained from magnetic resonance, very exquisite structural resolution, but poor sensitivity in terms of molarity. Most MR systems for humans, 3 Tesla MR systems, do not allow us to go far beyond the millimolar level. So you have a problem with looking at sensitivity. So you cannot look at processes that are very finely sensitive. This is all leading up for me to tell you that the subspecialty of imaging that I've considered my own is the preferred one. It's the preferred one because it allows imaging with sub-centimeter resolution, 4 to 5 millimeters. It also allows very high sensitivity, nanomolar, sometimes picomolar, but definitely nanomolar sensitivity. So you can detect very, very low concentrations of whatever it is you're detecting. It does, however, involve ionizing radiation, and for that reason it's not used as much as possible. The other great limitation with molecular imaging has been chemistry. Chemistry can be complex. Remember that when we do attach a radionuclide, a radioactive compound, a radioactive molecule, to the compound that we're interested in examining or interrogating, we are limited by the half-life of the radionuclide. So when we look at carbon-11, for example, which has a half-life of 20 minutes, it means that our synthesis has to be quick. We have to synthesize the product in quick enough time that there is still a large amount of radioactivity on the molecule. And then we have to have enough time also to carry out quality control so that the quality control will assure us that what we are injecting into the human satisfies all the requirements that the FDA and any sensible individual has. So carbon-11 with a half-life of 20 minutes means that we have to carry out the synthesis as well as the QC, as well as the quality control. The entire process has to be compressed ideally within an hour from scratch to finish. In the case of carbon-11 with its 20-minute half-life, scratch also involves bombarding the cyclotron because you need to get the carbon-11 from the cyclotron, attach it to the ligand of interest, carry out the quality control on the ligand of interest, and then inject it to the patient. So it's a balletic dance where the cyclotron is fired at about the same time that the patient is brought into the suite for the imaging, etc., etc. It's quite a coordinated, multidisciplinary enterprise. But first, what it is we use a lot of. Larry Schwartz, who's my chair, and who's responsible for this slide, and his group, some of whom are sitting here, have been instrumental in looking at novel ways to examine tumors. So with plain radiographs in the old days, remember the hand you see, Röntgen's hand, is basically a unidimensional image, a unidimensional representation. What CT scans have allowed us to do historically, until the very recent time, is look at two-dimensional objects. So we looked at area and circumference of objects. Now what we are entering into with 3D CAT scans is the ability to look at volumes of objects. And what we are finding out, especially in cancer, which is what this talks about, is that we are able to get much better appreciation of what happens to tumors after therapeutic interventions have been carried out. In this particular patient, this is a patient with an EGF receptor mutation who got a tyrosine kinase inhibitor that's very specific to this EGF receptor mutation. And you can see that the volumetric change is a far earlier harbinger of a response than looking at it just in a 2D sense, because in a 2D sense, either the area or the circumference would not be indicative of the degree of response. Oops. Similarly, magnetic resonance imaging, with its very high resolution, has transformed the way we look at disease. Most of you, I think, have heard of Angelina Jolie, and this is one of the reasons she decided to undergo a bilateral mastectomy because the incidence of contralateral breast cancers that has been spurred largely by MR imaging and research has convinced some of us that if you see cancer in one breast, it probably exists in the other breast. And this is an example where we showed with MR that this was indeed the case. In most cases, mammography, for example, mammography in this patient was negative. The other way in which magnetic resonance has been used has been to look at functional change within the tumor. I spoke to you earlier about the density of water. If a tumor has, as you can imagine, less water than surrounding normal tissue, and that is registered by a signal, in this case called the diffusion coefficient. You can also look at the perfusion of the tumor. How well does blood flow through the tumor? And look at that as an indicator of response. And in this case, it's a patient from here, again Larry's slide, where the patient received a tyrosine kinase inhibitor therapy before, and these scans are before and after initiation of that therapy. And you can see that the tumor is far less vascular in the lower panel as compared to the baseline, indicative of response. I'm going to move now to molecular imaging or PET scanning. And in this case, I'm going to use an example. This is the only example, well, sort of, where it's not a mass we are looking at. These are patients with psychiatric disorders, and this slide was given to me by Mark Slifstein from the Psych Institute. And what you can see here is that the top panel, the baseline, indicates the amount of dopamine receptor subtype 3 in the caudate and putamen of this particular patient with schizophrenia. When the patient was given a drug that specifically inhibited dopamine receptor subtype 3, the post-challenge, if you will, post-challenge image demonstrates that indeed the receptor occupancy by the tracer has been displaced by the drug. This enables us, therefore, to develop very, very specific drugs that that target very, very specific receptor subtypes, and that in turn enables the acceleration of drug development, because with quantitative analyses and quantitative estimates like this, you're able to, number one, use very few subjects to make the point. Number two, have very, very quick results. So, for example, this was done in the same day. Because carbon-11 has a 20-minute half-life, the first image was done in the morning. The subject got the dose, subject had lunch, came back, and the challenge study imaging was carried out. So you can get results with very few subjects, and this is being used increasingly by drug companies to find out if they should go forward with larger scale clinical trials, and the rest of the examples I'll show you will be in cancer, to go forward with larger scale clinical trials based on pharmacodynamic. This is a pharmacodynamic change, right? You have receptor occupancy. That receptor occupancy is displaced by your therapeutic. So it's a dynamic change that you're looking at from baseline to after challenge with the compound. David Lung has pioneered the use of a hybrid imaging modality where, at this institution, where he combines single photon imaging with standard CT scans. And this is a reconstruction of one of his subjects. And you can see here that this subject looks like a subject, like a human. But this is actually a CT rendering of the surface of this particular patient. And he can also then peel the patient layer by layer until he comes to the object that he's interested in, which is the parathyroid gland, there showed in yellow, which is located beneath the thyroid gland, which is there colored in blue. And by demonstrating that that particular parathyroid gland is hyperactive, he can again direct precision therapy for this particular patient with hyperparathyroidism. Now for some definitions. First, the definition of a biomarker. What is it we are looking at? And these definitions are all, by the way, approved. So when I distribute, if you want me to distribute this talk as a PDF or whatever it is, you can have all this. So the FDA defines a biomarker as a characteristic that is objectively measured. So the one I think most of us know about is a blood sugar. Blood sugar measurement represents a biomarker. That biomarker is elevated in patients with diabetes. When they receive anti-diabetic medication, that biomarker drops down to a normal range. Similarly, blood pressure is a biomarker. An elevation of blood pressure indicates a state which we know of as hypertension. You give an antihypertensive medication, again measure the blood pressure. The blood pressure is a biomarker. It can be objectively verified. The way I read the blood pressure is no different from the way you read the blood pressure. The way I see the blood sugar value is no different from the way you read the blood sugar value. That is what we're going to try and do with imaging. We're going to extrapolate what we do with biomarkers in general clinical practice and bring it to the utilization of imaging to guide us with therapy selection and with assessment of therapeutic efficacy. All right? So there are two kinds of clinical trials that incorporate imaging, and I'm not going to take long here because I don't know how many of you are interested in clinical trials. Suffice it to say, for the vast majority of clinical trials where we test our imaging biomarkers, these tests are carried out in drug development situations. So most of the time when we look at imaging biomarkers and we want to see how they're doing, we're actually doing that in the context of a drug that is being evaluated either for its safety or for its efficacy or for its comparability. And so Janet Woodcock, I don't know if this was distributed to you before today's talk, Janet Woodcock is the Deputy Director of the Food and Drug Administration, and Janet, about a decade ago, came up with this Critical Path Initiative, and this Critical Path Initiative, in essence, laid out a process whereby any biomarker, whether it is imaging or not, would be put through this process before it could be evaluated and accepted into clinical practice as a biomarker. So that process involves 4 steps, well, 3 steps really. The first step is verification. So verification means you want to know if this is any good. So you want to know, in essence, how accurate is this biomarker in describing the state of disease. That then leads to the process of validation. So once you've demonstrated that it's of some accuracy, some predetermined accuracy, and I'll give you a specific example as we go along, you've demonstrated that it has some accuracy which is acceptable to you, you move it into the broader sphere. Instead of doing it just in one center, in your own little ivory tower, with your own little very carefully selected subjects, you move to the broader world, you look at more centers, you look at different ways of doing the imaging, and you see if you can duplicate those results. So that would be your validation trial. Once that validation trial is carried out, you move into even further down the road of drug development, where you say that I have a substance that I believe is useful, I have demonstrated it's useful, I've validated its utility. Now I'm going to test this validated utility in the development of a particular therapeutic, and in so doing, I'm going to do 2 things. One is I'm going to demonstrate the efficacy of the therapy, but also I'm going to demonstrate the efficacy of my biomarker such that once that therapy is approved or once that disease condition is established, I can then use my biomarker as an integral component of whatever drug development I choose to do. And that's the final, the integral studies. So in an integral study, you're not testing the biomarker, but you're finally using the biomarker to test the therapeutic that you're studying. Okay? And as far as imaging biomarkers are concerned, I mean, her guidance is actually, it's a nice piece of work. Her guidance is fairly comprehensive. We use these 3 biomarkers because these 3 biomarkers, in my opinion, are those that are most relevant to the study of imaging biomarkers in cancer. Okay? So now you've noticed that starting all over the place, I've finally narrowed down my focus to include cancer. So in cancer, there are 3 basic biomarkers that can be utilized: prognostic, predictive, and pharmacodynamic. I spoke to you about blood pressure and glucose before. These are pharmacodynamic biomarkers, but they're also diagnostic biomarkers, which I'm not talking about today. A prognostic biomarker tells you, basically, is the disease bad? How bad is the disease? And that is important in precision medicine, because if the disease is bad, you're going to do something about it. If the disease is not bad, you may well decide to wait and watch. So prognostic biomarkers tell you how bad the disease is. Predictive biomarkers, on the other hand, are usually linked to a therapeutic. They tell you, I predict that this therapy is going to do well. So for example, if you have if there's a woman with breast cancer, you want to know whether her hormone receptors are positive or not in that tumor, because then you will predict that anti-hormone therapy will work in that woman. Okay, I'll show you some examples later. A pharmacodynamic biomarker is what most imaging biomarkers are. You carry out baseline imaging, you give your intervention, you repeat the study to see if there has been any change. Any change that you represent, any change that you detect is usually predictive of efficacy or lack thereof. Now I'm going to focus into molecular imaging. So PET is what I'm going to talk about for most of the rest of this talk, perhaps all of the rest of this talk, I'm not sure. What PET scans allow us to do is they allow us to get a snapshot of distribution of a particular tracer, of a particular, therefore, because a tracer binds to something, a ligand binds to some sort of receptor. In this case, what we are doing is we are looking at a map of hexokinase in the body. So hexokinase is overexpressed in 70 to 80% of malignancies. Hexokinase is very closely associated with RAS mutations. So you can give glucose, which is what this is, therefore get a map of hexokinase, also something else, glucose transporters. But hexokinase is what we primarily look at, the Warburg effect, if you want to be a purist. And that hexokinase is overexpressed in tumors, and so you can see all the tumors in this patient with metastatic kidney cancer light up after administration of glucose. You can also see the heart light up because the heart uses, the myocardium uses glucose, but not in the constitutive phase, but when the patient is not entirely fasted, it uses glucose. You also see the kidneys and the bladder, because the kidneys and the bladder excrete whatever glucose is not taken up by tissues and organs. And of course you see the liver, because the liver's got a lot of blood flow. And this can be used to help us understand how bad the disease is or how limited the disease is. And this is a patient with lung cancer who, when he presented to me, had only a suspicion of a node on the same side, which means that the patient was going to get radiation therapy. But when we did the bones, when we did the FDG scan, we found that there was disease in the bone, yeah? And we found that there was disease in the neck as well. And that meant that we had changed the stage of this patient, and that meant that this patient was no longer a suitable candidate for radiation therapy. Yet another application of an imaging modality used to guide precision medicine. And we can use it as a pharmacodynamic biomarker, which means that we can use it at baseline to demonstrate the disease in the lung. This is the same patient as the previous slide. Disease in the lung and the disease in the bone. And we can use it after therapy to demonstrate that this patient has indeed responded, not only in the lung and chest, but also in the bone. We use this in a wide variety of cancers because, as I said, 70 to 80% of cancers are KRAS positive, KRAS mutant positives, and therefore we can really look at what's happening with these cancers using deoxyglucose. So on the left side is a patient with an esophageal malignancy here, and this patient also has nodal disease. The patient got radiation therapy and chemotherapy, and afterwards there was a complete response. Indeed, imaging can be used to predict the pathologic outcome, and so if you see a response like this, you know two things, and I'll show you a couple of examples later. You know two things. One is that there has been a pathologic response, which is usually correlated by surgery, by histopathology. But more importantly, and I'll show you a very clear example in a different disease a couple of slides on, more importantly, you can demonstrate in this way that the patient is going to have an increase in survival. So when you're deciding what medications to use, imaging biomarkers can help you determine not only which medicine to use, which therapeutic to use, but also help you determine whether the therapy you're using is indeed effective or not. This is an example, yet another example of a, how am I doing on time? Not bad. This is yet another example of a study, and the reason I show this to everybody is that this is not just something that resides in the dark corners of my mind and in the dark corners of my lab, but this is a slide that was presented to the FDA for the fast-track evaluation and approval of a compound that also inhibits tyrosine kinase, and that had been found to be very, very useful in leukemia, in chronic myelogenous leukemia, that we looked at in gastrointestinal stromal tumors, which have a different oncogene mutation from most chronic myelogenous leukemias. But we showed that using FDG PET, we were able to demonstrate that there was that there was efficacy in a significant proportion of these patients. And the FDA took this as evidence of the utility of the compound, approved that compound for gastrointestinal stromal tumors, but wanted us to go back to them and demonstrate that this functional change we had demonstrated was actually paralleled by the structural change that we saw 3 months after we saw the functional change. An important thing to remember, it's intuitive, but it's nice for it to be demonstrated, which is that functional change and functional status always precede morphologic change and morphologic status. As I said to you earlier, this is not just pie in the sky. This actually makes a difference to the way patients are treated, and this makes a difference to us clinicians to be able to tell patients that they're going to live longer or not longer after a particular therapy has been instituted. So this is work from Australia, from the Peter Mac, and Rod Hicks and his group demonstrated very elegantly that a complete metabolic response in patients with breast cancer treated with chemotherapy, this is a very floridly positive breast cancer that becomes negative after therapy, predicts survival in contrast to a non-complete metabolic response. So using pharmacodynamic biomarkers, imaging biomarkers, helps to determine what therapy you're going to use, determine whether you continue the therapy or not, and has implications for overall survival and quality of life in patients with cancer. So pharmacodynamic biomarkers are definitely here to stay. Predictive biomarkers and prognostic biomarkers are a little further away as far as imaging is concerned. They're in the process now of being validated, and so a lot of what I'm going to show you is going to be verification studies and not really in the imaging field anything that's been established as an integral imaging biomarker. A predictive biomarker is what everybody likes. There is the example of a histopathology that was used to develop an antibody that is used in breast cancer. This histopathology was an immunohistopathology that determined which patients with breast cancer had a particular oncogene mutation called HER2. This oncogene mutation could be detected by immunopathology, and this oncogene mutation became then a prerequisite for therapy with an antibody that you know of probably as Herceptin. So Herceptin therapy requires a positive immunopathology study, okay? So the immunopathology study predicts Herceptin outcome. This immunopathology study is a predictive biomarker. And what I'm going to talk about, one example, is a predictive imaging biomarker. So this is a study done at the University of Washington, led by David Mankoff, who took my job at Penn. And what this study shows you is that if a patient has estrogen receptor positive disease, as determined by imaging with fluoroestradiol, that patient is going to respond to therapy with an aromatase inhibitor. On the other hand, if the patient does not have estrogen receptor positive disease, that patient's disease is not going to respond to aromatase inhibitor therapy, which is very specific to estrogen and progesterone receptors. You ask, why is the imaging important? Why is a $3,000 test important in this patient? Why could I not just look at the biopsy and see if the biopsy expressed the receptor or not? Oops, what happened? Because this is why I like this example. Because tumors evolve, cancers de-differentiate over time. And this is a good example because in this example, both these patients had estrogen receptor positive disease at the time of their initial surgery. But by the time they presented with metastatic disease, one of them had metastatic disease that was hormone receptor positive. The other one had metastatic disease that had de-differentiated and therefore become hormone receptor negative, illustrating again the importance of imaging in helping decide what kind of therapy to give patients. So that was a predictive imaging biomarker. Prognostic biomarker, by contrast, just tells you whether it's bad disease or good disease. Can that decision help you decide what kind of therapy you use? Absolutely. If you say you have bad disease, you will be treated more aggressively. If you have not so bad disease or good disease, if there is such a thing, then you will wait and watch or say, come back and see me in 3 years. If it's bad disease, you come back and see me day after tomorrow, I'm going to start therapy, right? So that's a prognostic biomarker. I'm going to use a personal biomarker that we developed over the past 20 years, just to give you an idea of how long it takes, as a prognostic imaging biomarker. And I want to bring another concept here called theranostics. Increasingly, we are using the same molecule labeled with different substances, different forms of radioactivity, as a diagnostic biomarker and as a therapeutic tool. Hence, theranostic. It's a portmanteau. This is an antibody that was developed 30 years ago in Leiden by Egbert Oosterwijk. Egbert came to New York at Memorial, where I was at that time, and we decided to use this antibody as a therapeutic in patients with clear cell cancer. Our mentor at the time, Lloyd Old, he continues to be my mentor, although I don't work there anymore and he is no more. Dr. Old had a paradigm then for antibody characterization, which is that we radio-labeled the antibody and we injected it into patients at various mass amounts because we thought that that was the best way to get information on antibody characteristics. We also insisted that all these patients go into be patients who were surgical candidates so that then we would get tissue. This is how it's relevant. Over 3 orders of magnitude, from 200 microgram to over 20 microgram, we were able to demonstrate that we could saturate normal receptor sites in the liver and we could optimize targeting of tumor by adjusting the mass. And we determined, I didn't show you all the other cohorts that we looked at, but we determined that the optimum mass amount was 10 milligram. We also determined that the optimum time for imaging was after 24 hours because we saw in this patient with bilateral disease that the optimum targeting to this clear cell renal cell cancer indeed occurred at 24 hours and not before. So we demonstrated through a series of clinical trials, funding was better in those days, or maybe I was just lucky, that we could target the clear cell renal cell cancer phenotype. You can see that immunohistochemistry demonstrates very tight correlation between antigen sites and antibody targeting. And we also identified at that time that carbonic anhydrase 9 was a target antigen. In the meantime, the natural history of kidney cancer changed. In the 80s, when I was seeing my patients for the first time with clear cell cancer, these patients had massive disease. They had 8 centimeter was the median size in 1988 of a kidney mass, which means I could feel it. I didn't need imaging. I could feel it. But with the explosion in the use of imaging, if you have a stomach ache, you're very likely to have an ultrasound. If you have back pain, you're very likely to have a CT. If you have some other problem, you're very likely to have a spine MR. And as a consequence, there's very likely to be serendipitous identification of renal masses. So the average size of a kidney tumor has changed from 8 centimeters in the late 80s to 2 centimeters in the late aughts. And as a consequence, the proportion of malignant renal masses has also changed during these 3 decades to over 90% malignant, over 90% clear cell phenotype, to about 65 to 70% clear cell phenotype. So it becomes even more important for us now to use a non-invasive method to identify whether that renal mass, that 2.3 centimeter renal mass, is malignant or not. Because if it's not malignant, you could wait and watch. If it's malignant, you would need to go in and do something about it. So the aggressiveness of the tumor has changed, and because the aggressiveness has changed, we need a non-invasive way, which is what imaging is all about, to identify that aggressive nature of that particular tumor. So we hypothesized, because by now we had figured that every time we gave this antibody to somebody with clear cell renal cell cancer, the antibody went to the tumor. So we said, why not look at it the other way around? Why not see if giving this antibody can help us determine who has the aggressive phenotype and who does not. So we carried out a verification trial first, right, to determine the accuracy. Now, when we constructed this, and I have very good biostatistics friends who, despite being friends, do not ease up on their biostatistical rigor, okay? So they wanted this study to be really rigorous. Mike Catan was there at the time at Sloan Kettering. And he wanted the accuracy of an imaging methodology to be at least comparable to the accuracy of biopsy, right? Otherwise, why do you need to have an expensive imaging test? You may as well have a biopsy, not so expensive. A little more traumatic, but not so expensive. So we decided, we looked at the literature and we found that the accuracy of biopsy, contrary to what you might believe, is not 100%. Even in the best of centers, the accuracy of biopsy is about 94 to 95% when compared to surgical resection of the mass. So we said we will use a very high threshold. We will use 90% as our accuracy determination standpoint. So we used 90%, and you can read the paper if you want to know exactly how we went about it. But we said it would be 90%, and we took people with kidney masses who were going to have their kidney masses removed. We gave them the antibody, and we carried out imaging. And here's what we found. We found that in patients who had the clear cell phenotype, you could see it very, very clearly. In patients who did not have the clear cell phenotype, you could see the absence of uptake also very, very clearly. In fact, we had an equivocal column in our statistical makeup, but the equivocal column was never filled. We were able to say that a patient had positive or negative scans in all the patients that we looked at, all the 26 patients that we looked at. And we were able to do that by something else that's becoming increasingly common, which is hybrid imaging. I'm showing you the positive, because if I showed you the negative, you wouldn't have a clue what I was talking about. But there was no way I could have called this lesion as being negative if I wasn't able to fuse the CT and the PET in these patients, and therefore identify that the CT abnormality did not have a PET correlate. And this was then verified when the patients went into surgery, because remember, all these patients went into surgery. We were able to verify with regular histopathology that the patients had clear cell cancer. We were able to verify that the antibody I had given a week earlier had indeed gone to wherever there was clear cell. And we were able to verify that the antigen, carbonic anhydrase 9, was present wherever there was antibody uptake, wherever there was clear cell. Okay? That's your positive, and that's your negative. So with PET and biopsy and immunohistochemistry, we were able to examine the panoply of the cancer phenotype that was made available to us. And we had great success. We had a positive predictive accuracy that was 100%. We had a specificity. In other words, we could say when there was no disease of 100% as well. And so that gave us enough encouragement that we decided to enlarge our horizons and look at a multi-center trial that would then lead to FDA approval. So this would then be the validation study. So for the validation study, the FDA wanted us to look at something that is called a truth standard, which means what is the best thing that's already out there and that's used by everybody. And by interviewing a variety of urologists and radiologists who knew a lot about kidney masses, we determined that that would be the CT. And so we carried out a comparability study comparing our PET CT with CT in patients with renal masses who were about to undergo surgery. The FDA liked the design, not after a lot of hand-wringing. The FDA liked the design and gave us what is called a special protocol assessment, which means that after this study, we could actually apply to get the product approved for general use and for reimbursement by insurance companies. So this would be the validation trial. So we had the usual criteria for patient inclusion, and this is what we found. In patients who had very clearly positive CTs for clear cell cancer, the antibody was positive. There was an important subset where they were CT positive by criteria that were both quantitative and qualitative, but they were antibody negative, and the antibody was right in most of the instances. So the antibody provided greater specificity than did the CT. And there was also instances where the CT quantitative criteria did not quite meet the requirements we had for clear cell, but the antibody then actually won out. And what that meant was that we were able to use the antibody to identify the clear cell phenotype, not only in the tumor itself, but in those rare patients who presented with the tumor and with metastatic disease, in the metastatic disease as well. The moment you leave your ivory tower, your results are going to drop. So our accuracy was 94% and 100% in the initial trial that we had done in one center in a carefully selected population with a pathologist that was outstanding and a surgeon that was outstanding. The moment we went into the wider world, we had to lower our expectations, but still our expectations were pretty well met, and we reached sensitivity and specificity of 86%, which was better than the truth standard that we had set for ourselves, which was CT. Why am I going through this exercise? I'm going through this exercise to tell you that A, it takes a heck of a long time. B, it requires a fair amount of money. C, it's a multidisciplinary approach. You need input from pathologists, from surgeons, from internists, as well as from your fellow imaging experts. And D, you need to be able to demonstrate that what you're going to do is going to eventually impact patient care. Precision medicine all over again. Precision involves selection as one of its important initial criteria. The other reason I'm telling you all this is because, if I mentioned earlier, the biology was such that we began to identify an antigen which is carbonic anhydrase 9. While carbonic anhydrase 9 is a byproduct of a VHL mutation, von Hippel-Lindau mutation, it's also a concomitant. It may not be a causative, it may not be downstream. It may be a concomitant of hypoxia-inducible factors. Hypoxia-inducible factors are those that are associated with bad tumors outside of the kidney. So if you have a head and neck malignancy that is HIV positive, that patient is going to do worse than the patient who has HIV negative disease. Stage matched, same size, same characteristics. HIV positive will do worse than HIV negative. That's very clearly demonstrated. It's possible then that we will be able to use this antibody to identify those head and neck tumors, perhaps lung lesions, that are hypoxic, hypoxia-inducible factor, and therefore again use this antibody imaging to prognosticate those patients with bad disease versus those patients with not so bad disease. So in this case, with head and neck cancer, if I have an antibody negative patient, I'll still treat the patient, I'll still give the patient radiotherapy and chemotherapy, but I will be more aggressive with my radiotherapy if the patient is hypoxia positive. I may use a different radiotherapy because radiotherapy and hypoxia are also very closely interlinked. And so that will help me decide the nature of the therapy as well by using imaging. So I'm going to end by pointing out again that the three biomarkers that we're interested in is prognostic, predictive, and pharmacodynamic in imaging. These biomarkers are important, if not crucial, in the proper selection of therapeutics, in cancer in particular, but also in neuroscience, especially in neuroscience for drug development rather than drug validation and establishment. So imaging is going to help us decide and determine how bad the tumor is, whether the particular therapy we've selected will do any good, and whether the particular therapy that we are using is doing any good. And molecular imaging lends itself uh, 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 very well because the resolution is now sub-centimeter. You can look at a multiplicity of just as you have spectral, multispectral histopathology that you can look at these days, you can also look at multispectral photons and carry out multispectral in vivo imaging. Most importantly, because it's imaging and it's in vivo, it's not very invasive, and you can look at the whole body in real time. And that's the reason I showed you the breast cancer example, because tumors change, cancers change, the disease processes change over time, so the historical record you have may not be relevant at the time that you're planning your precision intervention. And with imaging, particularly molecular imaging, you can look at metabolism. I showed you glucose, phenotype. I showed you the carbonic anhydrase 9, as well as the milieu, which I've not shown you a direct example of, but is an indirect example from the hypoxia components that I showed you. So it's a long slog, but somebody's got to do it. And I want to thank my 3 mentors who've helped me put this together as well as my thinking together. Thank you.